Good morning, everybody. It's week 2 in Introduction to Literary Studies. I'm Dr. Emily Friedman, and I teach literary studies with games. Games as cultural objects that are worth taking a look at alongside canonical literary works. But today, it's an interesting combination of the two. H.G. Wells is acknowledged as an important writer and contributor to 20th century science fiction, among many other things. It's not especially controversial to add him to a course on literary studies. But what might be unusual is the text that I'm choosing and how I'm teaching it today. Students have been asked to read Wells's Guide to Wargaming at Home, Little Wars, as a literary text, but also as an instructional text. Recent scholars have talked about the ways in which we can think in both of these ways about all kinds of game texts, even today. So often we think about them as design documents, right? They're teaching you how to play a game. You want to navigate them well. You want them to have good user interfaces so that you can know how to play the game. But they can also be understood as cultural objects and often literary objects that people read for fun, for story. There's any number of folks all over who are thinking in those kinds of terms as well. Some have argued that that's the way that you capture the imagination of a potential game master or group in the case of GM-less games, which I've posted about on the channel earlier today. So we're going to dive right into something that is potentially both familiar and unfamiliar with the theme of this course. So we've got some green terrain in the form of a very cheap green tablecloth. And we've got a whole mess of meeples. And because I teach at a university with very strong commitments to school colors, the two teams are indeed in our school colors. We also have a bunch of terrain. So we've got yellow for potential buildings and things along those lines, green for maybe some trees and whatnot. But I'm not telling the students how to use this material. Wells should be. I'm giving them the raw material. They've read Little Wars. And the first thing that we're going to do is get a table in our active learning classroom, throw the tablecloth on it, maybe put some books under to vary the terrain, and see what students do when they try to run the game. And it's worth noting, I'm not the only person doing this. Any number of other folks are doing this. Just down the road, my colleague at Mercer University, Cameron Kunzelman of Game Study Buddies, and a whole bunch of other stuff, is throwing the same challenge at his own game design students. What's a little bit different here is that we're going to go meta, which is to say, we're then going to, after we struggle and try and figure out how to create projectiles, because I didn't find cannons, if you have a recommendation for where to find safe, not dangerous like projectiles that can be used in a college classroom, please feel free to throw something in the comments. I'm not a war gamer. I'm just play one for the purposes of today. But so we're then going to think about, okay, so what were we noticing in the text? How are we reading it? How are we processing it? I have not yet told them this is how I read a TTRPG because I want to see what they intuit just kind of without being instructed. And then we can come back really next week and start to think about that again from a different lens. In the next case, we're going to be thinking about parlor games, but more on that in a bit. And then we're going to have Meg A. Baker and Jay Dragon in the room to help me teach them how we take different strategies for how to encounter different game texts, each of which is going to, like any other literary text, teach us how it wants to be read. So this is fun and hopefully kinetic and a little bit silly, but the goal ultimately today is to transition from that moment of kinetic being silly and foolish together and figuring it out to thinking about what in the text made us think in the ways that we did. What's missing from the text? And of course, whoa, what's in the text? Which this is now a class of all femme students, which is unusual and striking, and an interesting moment to think about things like the fact that the subtitle of Little Wars and the opening kind of gestures assume that only very intelligent and very unusual girls and women will ever want to play. Most of the time that the feminine is mentioned in Little Wars is to imagine long skirts getting in the way, sweeping past any number of obstacles that have been meticulously set up. We see men being little boys again. And the only way that they can do that is if they are unimpeded by girls who don't get it. And this is a little close to home for me. I am part of an almost 11-year 5th edition D&D campaign here with my historian friends. It is incredibly important and wonderful part of my experience, and I almost missed out on it because when they were recruiting initially to start that game at a board game party, they didn't think that I would want to play. I had to actually bully and actively say, I'm interested. Why are you not asking me? To which they said, we thought you were cool. And so we see this really interesting tension. For them, they weren't thinking about this as a masculine exclusion of their female colleague. They were thinking about it in terms of who's interested. But of course, their idea of who was interested is burdened by their past experiences in the hobby, as are all of ours. And hopefully, we have new experiences and new ways of playing that are welcoming a bigger tent. I'm thinking about this a lot this week in particular, but always. So ultimately, I suspect today is going to be a conversation about gender. And then that conversation is going to continue and get even more complicated as we talk on Wednesday about a literary text that is cited by Wells in Little Wars. Wells says that he thinks that in TRISTRAM Shandy, one of the great experimental 18th century novels by Laurence Sterne, that the beloved Uncle Toby, one of my favorite characters in literature, a beautiful and moving portrayal of PTSD in a broadly comic and yet oddly touching kind of way, is watching someone play Little Wars. Because Uncle Toby's strategy for working through his trauma is literally to build out the circumstances under which he was wounded in the war. And so we're going to read that part the way that Sterne's narrator, TRISTRAM Shandy, a guy who can't even tell his life story in a linear fashion because he can't get past his conception and birth, digresses to tell us about his uncle and how his uncle is indeed playing Little Wars. And this is an experiment to see what happens when we read Little Wars and then we read back in time to the 18th century to see, is Wells right? Is indeed there a parallel here? And does something open up in each of these texts that allows them to be richer than they were alone? Because this is what literary studies is, guys, even with and without meeples. I'm curious to see what you think. I'm going to put publicly available copies of all of the readings into the show notes when I post this, and I hope you'll join me. I discuss this kind of stuff in more detail on Patreon for any number of reasons, but it's free to read. There may be extended content later on for what I call my extra credit level, but as a baseline for things like talking about teaching, it's just a subscriber wall, no cost. So wish me luck, and I'll report back soon.